You have 12 hours to get out, or I will have the sheriff drag you out of here. My daughter said that to me in my own kitchen, hand resting on the island I sanded with my late husband 30 years ago, like she was confirming a booking, not tearing up my life. Outside, October wind shoved salt against the glass. The clock over the stove said 7:58 in the evening, and the ocean kept hitting the sand as if it had not heard the deadline. On the counter sat a thick folder. Company retreat plan, move-out checklist. On top, a yellow note in heavy black ink that said, "Mom done by 8 a.m. My name is Marilyn Tate, 62 years old, widow, nurse for 35 years. And apparently tonight I have been downgraded from mother to problem to be removed." Lauren did not flinch after she said it. She watched me with the cool eyes she used in meetings, blazer still on lipstick. Perfect. "You wandering around this place alone is depressing, Mom," she said. Her mouth curled, not quite a smile. "This is not a home anymore. It is a fire hazard with memories." Derek laughed from the living room. He walked slow circles, phone held out at arm length, showing my beach house to someone on a video call. "Ignore the old decor, man," he said. "By the time you see it, the old lady will be out and the wine wall will be in." A voice on the other end whistled. "That view is insane. 7 figures easy." Lauren tapped the folder with one manicured finger. "We need you packed tonight," she said. "Derek needs this place for his clients by the end of the month. His reputation depends on it. You sitting here humming over old photo albums is not a good use of a $5 million asset. Asset, not home. Not the house your father built, board by board." My fingers tightened around the dish towel. "Lauren, you do not just order your mother out of her house," I said. "This is my address. This is where I live." She sighed loud and theatrical. "Mom, listen. We have talked about this. You should not be alone out here anyway. What if you fall? What if you forget the stove? What if a storm hits? We cannot keep running down from Raleigh every time you lose power. It is not safe." I looked around the kitchen. Clean counters, bills stacked and paid on the side table, fresh batteries in the smoke detectors. "You know I take care of myself," I said. "I still drive to Wilmington. I still volunteer at the hospital. I remember my appointments. I am not helpless." "I am not saying you are helpless," she said. "I am saying you are not thinking clearly about what makes sense." Derek ended his call and leaned in the doorway, smiling like a man about to explain something simple. "We love you, Marilyn," he said. "We are just trying to protect the family. This place is a gift, but right now it is just sitting here collecting dust and property tax. We can turn it into something powerful. Corporate retreats, leadership weekends. That is real value. And where am I supposed to go while you are building value?" I asked. Lauren already had papers ready. "Directions to my son apartment in Raleigh. Your old room is still there," she said. "It will be good for you. Someone can keep an eye on you." The way she said that made my stomach twist. Keep an eye on you, like I was a toddler or a patient waiting for a wristband. "I am not moving in with Julian," I said. "That boy can barely keep his plants alive." Lauren's eyes hardened. "You do not really have a choice," she said softly. "If you refuse, we will have to do this another way." My heart stumbled. "What other way?" "I already talked to your doctor about a wellness check," she said. "If you cannot see that you are not safe here alone, the court can help you see it. They can appoint someone to manage things. It is not a threat, Mom. It is just the process." My blood went cold. "You would tell a judge I cannot take care of myself, that I am not in my right mind." Derek shifted his weight and looked at the counter. "Sometimes intervention looks harsh in the moment," he said, "but in the long run, everybody is grateful. I had spent my career watching families do this to elders they claimed to love. Smile in the room, sign papers in the hall, let words like capacity and best interest erase a person who is still breathing. Now my own children were practicing the script. Lauren walked to the hooks by the back door, plucked my car keys off, and dropped them into her purse. "You should not be driving at night anymore," she said. "Derek will take you to Raleigh in the morning. You do not decide that anymore." That sentence hit harder than anything else she had said. Then she opened the fridge and began sticking colored labels on my food. Keep, trash, donate. She did not look at me while she did it, as if she were sorting a storage unit, not her mother kitchen. My eyes went to the mantel in the living room. The framed photo of my husband Ray smiled from his usual spot, the pier behind him, bright in summer light. For a moment my throat burned so much I could not speak. I wanted to shout, to grab the folder, to slam the door in their faces. Instead, something inside me shifted. The buzzing in my head went quiet. The room came into sharp focus. On the small table by the window, my phone lit up. A new email, Briggs & Cole, portfolio review, total holdings update. Under it, another banner from an app Lauren never asks about, board chat, hospital foundation, meeting agenda. I watched the banners appear and fade. Lauren never glanced. She has never cared about the parts of my life that do not orbit her. Funny thing about family, I thought. In a toxic family, the quiet one is always assumed to be the poorest. Lauren closed the folder and clapped her hands once, like she was ending a meeting. So? 12 hours, Mom. We will be back in the morning with the truck. Just pack what you absolutely need. The rest the cleaners will handle. Derek patted my shoulder on his way past as if we had agreed. My chest hurt, but my voice came out calm and steady. 12 hours, I said. All right, Lauren. She hesitated just for a heartbeat, surprised it was that easy, then put her warm daughter's smile back on. It is what is best for everyone, she said. I walked to the mantel and took down Ray's photo, then to the drawer by the pantry where I kept a small canvas bag. I placed 3 things inside: Ray's photo, my worn leather notebook, and a sealed envelope with a dark blue law firm logo I had not yet opened. At the doorway, I looked back at her one last time. Are you sure this is what you want? I asked. She nodded without looking up from her phone. It is what makes sense. Out on the porch, the night air was sharp with salt and the slow roar of waves. I closed the door gently behind me and felt something in my chest harden into place. This was no longer just about a house. Standing there with 12 hours on the clock in the middle of my own family betrayal, dressed up as concern, I knew exactly what they had done. And they were about to learn what really happens when you turn love into a numbers game. I was still standing on that porch after Lauren deadline when memory pulled me backward into a quieter time, a time when the house behind me smelled like pine boards and Ray laughter instead of fresh paint samples and retreat schedules, and the ache of that contrast carried me straight into the past without my permission, because that is where the first crack in all of this truly began. My name is Marilyn Tate, 62 now, and widowed 3 years, and before my daughter decided I was a liability to be relocated, I spent more than 3 decades as a nurse supervisor in Wilmington, working night shifts that bled into morning light, counting pennies so the lights would stay on and the pantry would stay stocked, and those years shaped me more than any title or board seat ever could. Ray and I built our life the slow way, the honest way, meeting when we were barely out of our teens and marrying before either of us fully understood how hard the world could be. Yet even then, Ray had a steady hand and a patient mind traits he carried into every beam and floorboard of the beach house he designed on Ocean Isle Beach in the early 90s, when that stretch of coast was still quiet, still affordable, still lined with mom and pop bait shops instead of polished resorts and investors looking for their next rental property. The house grew room by room under Ray hands, the cedar siding. He stained himself the broad porch overlooking the dunes, where we drank coffee on storm mornings. The wooden floors he laid with boards he rejected twice before accepting their grain, and in the living room he hung an old nautical chart of the North Carolina coastline that he found at a flea market, a map he studied for hours as if memorizing every curve could anchor him to the world. We raised 2 children inside those walls, Lauren, our firstborn, who came into the world with a sharp mind and sharper ambition, long before she learned to speak in full sentences, and Eli, our son, who absorbed Ray, calm, steady pace and followed it into adulthood, choosing the life of a high school history teacher with a modest salary and a modest apartment in Wilmington because he valued time over luxury and meaning over image. We taught them the same things our parents taught us, that you work for what you want. You do not stack debt to pretend you have more than you do. You treat others with respect, and you never forget where you came from. Lessons that Eli took to heart and Lauren treated as optional suggestions she might circle back to someday once she finished building her idea of a life. The seed of injustice, the one that has been sprouting roots for years, was planted long before Lauren ever held a key to my house, and long before Derek ever whispered the word equity, like a promise. It began during the financial crisis in 2008 when Ray and I nearly lost the house we lived in. Not this beach house, but our primary home. Because over time, hours evaporated, and medical bills piled up, and banks called loans with a coldness that could freeze a person from the inside out. And while Ray picked up every extra shift he could, and I worked nights until my legs throbbed, Lauren came home from college during one of her breaks, looked at our tired faces and the stack of past due notices, and said one sentence that sliced through the air like a quiet knife. "I am never going to live like you two," she said. "I will make real money." She said it with certainty, not cruelty, as if she were stating the weather. But the words stayed with me, because they revealed something Ray and I were too busy surviving to see, that while we were trying to show our children resilience and responsibility, Lauren was learning something else entirely, a belief that the life we lived was beneath her, and the life she wanted would require turning everything into an asset and every person into a stepping stone. I told myself it was youth talking, that once she stood on her own 2 feet, she would soften. She would understand what it meant to build something weatherproof and simple. And in some ways, she did. She graduated, she moved to Raleigh. She climbed her way into a marketing director role at a tech startup and curated an image of a woman who had everything figured out, but none of that changed the hollow place her old words left in me. When Ray died in 2021 from a sudden heart attack that hit him before sunrise, while he brewed coffee in the kitchen, he built the grief shattered me in ways I still cannot fully name, and after the funeral, when the guests left and the casseroles cooled, Ray lawyer Samuel Briggs handed me an envelope with Ray handwriting on it, a short note attached to his will that said everything in his quiet, steady way. "Everything goes to you, Mayor," he wrote, and then in smaller letters, "If they ever treat you like they treated me, protect yourself." I did not understand that last line fully until much later, but I nodded when Briggs suggested placing the beach house into a living trust and setting up an LLC to protect it from claims or misuse steps that seemed overly cautious at the time, but made sense under the weight of Ray's final wish. And I kept those details to myself, sharing only vague comments with the children, because something in my chest insisted that silence was safer. At the funeral reception, Lauren made a joke she probably thought was harmless. She stood with a glass of wine in her hand and said, "At least the house is paid off," as if my husband's death had cleared a ledger for her convenience. And Derek, not realizing I was close enough to hear, told Eli that the beach house carried unused equity that could be leveraged into something more productive. A comment that made Eli go stiff and quiet because he understood the tone. He understood the way Derek scanned the room like a man looking for things to label and convert. These were small moments, but they stacked on top of that old sentence from 2008, and they grew until they formed the roots of the storm. I was now standing in a storm that carried me right back to Ray's final words. "Do not let anyone turn you into an asset, Mayor, not even our kids." As I stood on the porch in the present, the ocean dark and restless beyond the dunes, that line settled into my bones, forming the foundation of the resistance I had not yet spoken aloud, but already felt rising. After Ray's funeral, the house felt too quiet, and the days stretched in a way that made the nights heavier. And in that vulnerable space, Lauren stepped in with a kind of care that looked helpful on the surface, but carried an undertow. I did not feel at first. It began with her suggestion that we simplify things, that I let her install a banking application on my phone and set automatic payments so I would not have to keep track of everything alone. And because grief softens defenses, I handed her my phone and my trust without thinking of what I was giving away. She typed quickly, linking accounts, shifting settings, telling me she was only giving herself view access so she could check on things if needed, saying it in a tone that implied I could not possibly manage the simplest digital task without her oversight. And I nodded because I did not want to argue or seem ungrateful, yet something about the way she spoke settled into my ribs like a small stone. A week later, she changed the email connected to my utility bills to her own, telling me it would keep my inbox clean, that she would filter important notices for me, and she laughed when I hesitated, saying I would not want spam piling up or scams tricking me, saying it with a light, teasing voice that tried to mask the sting underneath, but did not hide the fact that she was taking pieces of my independence and placing them into her hands as if they belonged to her more than to me. Over time, the comments grew sharper. Small remarks hidden inside casual conversations like, "You would be lost without me, Mom," or "I do not know how you managed anything before I stepped in." And each sentence took something from me. Not enough to protest, but enough to dim the room a little, enough to make me feel like a visitor in my own life while she moved furniture in my mind without asking. At the same time, there was the matter of the college funds, money Ray had set aside with such care that he researched investment options for months, reading brochures under the porch light, while waves broke in the dark, and he opened 2 separate 529 plans for Maddie and Josh Lauren children. Writing their names on sticky notes, he placed inside his desk drawer to remind himself to deposit each quarter. And after he passed, those accounts felt like part of him still working toward the future. One afternoon, Lauren called, and her tone was rushed and bright in a way that usually signaled a request wrapped in urgency. She said the kitchen remodel had gone slightly over budget, and they just needed a little breathing room that they could borrow from the kids' college fund and pay it back in a year, once Derek Bonus posted, saying it with such confidence that it sounded like a harmless adjustment, not a raid on our own children's future. And although my stomach tightened, I agreed because I still believed what she told me. After the call, I sat on the porch holding Ray's photo and asked him quietly whether I had done the right thing, and the wind off the water felt like a sigh against my cheek, gentle but uneasy. And I pushed that feeling down, because trusting your child is supposed to be the natural thing, the correct thing, the only thing. During this period, Eli checked on me more often, driving from Wilmington after school to bring soup or help with yard work, and he always asked softly whether I felt overwhelmed or whether Lauren's involvement had become too much. But I waved him off, not wanting to create tension between siblings or feed any fault lines that already existed, and he would nod, even though his eyes said he did not entirely believe my reassurances. Eli had always seen Lauren clearly, not cruelly, but honestly. And he warned me once in a quiet voice, "Lauren thinks everything is negotiable if it makes money." Mom and I laughed it off, saying that people change with age and responsibility. Yet his words planted themselves next to the old memory of her comment in 2008, forming a tiny echo that followed me around the house. With each month that passed, the soft control wrapped itself tighter, Lauren calling to remind me of medical appointments I had scheduled myself. Lauren reorganizing my spice cabinet without asking because she thought it was inefficient. Lauren emailing my insurance provider to update my contact details because she insisted their system was outdated, and each action framed as kindness chipped away at something in me I could not name yet. I began to feel as if I were being supervised rather than supported, as if I had become a fragile object no one trusted me to hold. And although I tried to ignore the discomfort, it grew heavier with every interaction, especially when she spoke to me in that half-gentle, half-condescending tone that carried the weight of judgment under the flavor of concern. The shift became unmistakable the night I logged into the college accounts on a whim, something I had not done since Ray handled them, and I found the balances painfully low, almost empty with no repayment deposits visible, and no explanation that made sense, except the truth I had been hoping not to see, that the money had been taken and not returned, and likely not even missed in the whirlwind of Lauren projects and Derek's schemes. I stared at the numbers for a long time, the room quiet except for the low thrum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of waves outside the window, and I felt something in my chest crack just slightly, not loud enough to draw tears or anger yet, but steady enough to mark the point where trust began to crumble, and I closed the laptop, slowly knowing that I was not ready to confront her, but also knowing that a fracture had formed that would not heal easily. Thanksgiving arrived with the kind of chilled salt air that always drifted across Ocean Isle Beach in late November, and although the house still smelled like Ray's cedar boards and the cinnamon rolls I baked every year, something in the atmosphere felt shifted, as if Lauren had already claimed hostess rights. Before she set foot inside, she swept through the doorway carrying trays of food and greeting neighbors as though this were her property, not mine. Her voice bright and confident in a way that filled every room while I moved more quietly at the edges. By late afternoon, the table was set with more dishes than we needed, the kitchen buzzing with heat, and Voice's neighbors, Donna and Mark, stopping by for dessert as they had done for years, and Eli arriving with a store-bought pie he apologized for, even though no one minded yet. While the house brimmed with familiar warmth, there was a tension beneath it that only I seemed to feel, a subtle sense that I had become a guest rather than the woman who had once held everything together. When dessert was served and plates clinked lightly against the wooden table, Lauren took her place at the head, as if that had always been her seat, and began chatting loudly with the neighbors about the season, the beach traffic, the rising value of oceanfront homes. Then, without warning, she shifted topics and said with a laugh that carried across the whole room, "Mom almost let the property tax lapse this year. Can you believe that good thing I am keeping an eye on things?" The words hit me like cold water because I had not forgotten anything at all. The notice had gone straight to her email after she changed the contact settings, and she was the one who missed it. Yet here, she was turning her oversight into my incompetence in front of neighbors I had known for decades, while she had only visited them on holidays. I felt my chest tighten as all eyes turned toward me, some pitying, some politely surprised, and I tried to keep my face steady, though I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, so I forced a small smile and said nothing, not wanting to contradict my daughter or escalate anything in front of company, but inside something small and sharp twisted hard. Derek raised his glass, then a gesture that seemed celebratory but carried an undercurrent of ownership, and he said, "To the future of this place. When we finally modernize it, imagine what we could do with a $5 million oceanfront if someone younger was in charge." His tone smooth and casual, as if he were discussing investment property with colleagues instead of talking about the home where my husband and I built our life board by board. A ripple moved across the table as a couple of neighbors glanced at me with discomfort. Their expressions a mix of confusion and sympathy, the kind people wear when they witness something they know is wrong but are unsure how to intervene, and I felt my heart sink as though the floor beneath the table had shifted. Eli sat beside me, his posture stiffening at Derek's comment, and he reached under the table to gently squeeze my hand, a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking, because it meant he understood exactly what was happening, but was trying not to make a scene, and I appreciated that, even as I wished for the strength to say something myself. The rest of dessert passed in a blur for me, laughter sounding distant conversation muted behind the roar of my own humiliation, and when the neighbors began gathering dishes and offering to help with cleanup, I quietly carried a tray to the kitchen, focusing on the familiar rhythm of rinsing plates rather than the ache under my ribs. After most guests had drifted out, Donna lingered near the porch door, her face soft with concern, and she touched my arm gently before saying in a low voice, "Are you okay, Marilyn? They talk like they already own the place." and although I smiled and brushed it off with a playful comment about children overstepping, I knew her words landed in the exact spot where the hurt had settled. When the last car pulled away and silence returned to the house, the evening replayed in my mind with a clarity that felt almost cruel, each comment echoing louder without the cushion of conversation to soften it. And for the first time, I understood how deeply Lauren had begun to rewrite the story of who I was, even in front of people who had known me long before she was born. That night, I lay awake listening to the waves crash in their steady rhythm against the shore, a sound that usually soothed me, but now felt like a reminder of how quickly stability can erode. And I stared at the ceiling, wondering how my own child could treat me like background noise in the home I had kept alive through decades of storms and sacrifice. Voice-over thoughts drifted through me in a whisper I did not dare speak aloud, wondering how many other women had been talked about as though they were not in the room, and how many had swallowed their dignity to keep peace with the children they loved more than themselves. And the question rose inside me like a quiet plea. Has anyone ever spoken over you in your own home as if you were fading and they were rising? I did not say it to anyone yet, but the sentiment lodged itself in my chest, marking the first real drop in the journey I had not chosen, but could now feel pulling me forward. And as the waves rolled in and out, I realized I had crossed the threshold from discomfort into something deeper. A sense of sinking that signaled this humiliation was not an isolated moment, but the beginning of a much steeper fall. The weeks after Thanksgiving slipped into the first cold breaths of the new year, and although I tried to settle the humiliation into a quiet corner of my mind, the unease only grew heavier as Lauren and Derek began treating the beach house not as the place Ray and I built, but as a flexible asset they could bend to whatever purpose suited them. It started small, the way control always does, with Lauren telling me that Derek colleague needed a quiet place for a weekend retreat, just a short stay to help him finish a pitch deck, and she assured me it would be harmless because he was a friend, responsible, tidy, no trouble at all, and because I did not want to seem unreasonable, I said yes. The first time was mostly fine, though I returned Sunday evening to discover an empty wine bottle on the kitchen island and a stack of damp towels piled on Ray's old rocking chair. Little things that I cleaned up without complaint. But then a week later, Derek asked if another coworker could use the place for a team brainstorming session. And then there was a client who wanted an oceanfront getaway to decompress. And before I even understood the shift, the requests had turned into expectations, and the house filled with strangers whose shoes left marks on the floors Ray polished with his own hands. Soon it was no longer Derek asking, it was Lauren announcing that the house would be booked for a long weekend, because she had promised it, and I found myself coming home to full trash bins, blankets tossed across the couch, and once a man I had never seen sleeping soundly on the sofa where Ray used to nap after long days in the workshop, his open mouth snoring softly against a cushion my husband bought the summer Maddie was born, and the sight made something tight and painful coil inside my chest. The worst part was not the mess. It was the slow erasing of Ray presence from the house piece by piece, Lauren claiming she was helping by removing old items, first his toolbox that she said looked rusty and hazardous, then the rocking chair on the porch that she labeled unsafe and unstable. Then the small jar of sea glass he collected during early morning walks, which she tossed without mentioning, because she believed it cluttered the shelves, and when I asked her gently to leave his things alone, she snapped with a sharpness that startled me, saying I was living in a museum and refusing to move forward, reminding me that Dad is gone. Mom and this house needs to work for us now. Her voice carrying a tone that made it clear she believed her vision mattered more than my memory. Around the same time, she began weaving a new narrative about me, a story she told to relatives and friends with a sigh of concern that masked something colder. She mentioned that I had forgotten the oven on one afternoon, even though the truth was that I had simply left a batch of cookies a few minutes too long and ended up with a tray of crisp edges. but Lauren recounted it as a near disaster, telling people Mom almost burned down the kitchen. And Derek chuckled and added that soon I might wander off the pier if no one kept an eye on me. Comments that were meant as jokes, but carried the weight of accusation. These remarks filtered into family conversations with the quiet persistence of Ivy, crawling along a wall, subtle at first, but increasingly present. And I began to feel eyes on me, evaluating, wondering, questioning my competence. Even though nothing in my daily life had actually changed, I still drove myself to church, still managed my errands, still handled my medications, yet Lauren made it sound like I was teetering on the edge of confusion. In early spring, she insisted I see a neurologist, assuring me it would ease her mind and give us clarity. And although I felt uneasy, I went because part of me wanted confirmation that I was still the woman I had always been, the doctor, a polite man who happened to play tennis with Derek on weekends, perform basic tests and ask questions about my routines, then told me gently that I displayed age, appropriate forgetfulness, and no signs of dementia. A conclusion that should have eased my heart but barely mattered because Lauren only repeated the parts that suited her, telling relatives that the doctor said we should keep an eye on her, leaving out every reassurance he had given me. I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror at night, asking silently if I was slipping, if the narrative Lauren built had truth inside it. Yet whenever I checked the details of my day, I found no evidence of decline. I still paid my bills, remembered appointments, cooked meals without incident, and although I felt shaken by the constant second-guessing, I also felt something steadier beginning to form beneath the doubt, a small refusal to accept the version of me that Lauren was trying to sell. The final turn in this loop came when Derek mentioned casually during a phone call that he had promised his company executives a coastal retreat, describing my home as if it were a corporate asset waiting to be leased. And while he spoke with enthusiasm about team bonding activities and presentation spaces, my mind drifted to the porch where Ray and I once watched storms roll in, and I realized with a sinking heaviness that somewhere between grief and trust, I had let my home become their venue without ever giving true consent. As I stood in the hallway after the call, listening to the hush of waves outside, the question rose in my mind with a clarity that cut through all the noise. When did my home become their venue? And the answer I feared had been forming long before I noticed the shift. The weeks that followed moved with an unnerving smoothness, the kind of deceptive calm that often settles just before a deeper breach, and I found myself going through motions I once recognized as my own life, while an invisible pressure tightened around me. Then one Thursday morning in late March, Lauren called and invited me to lunch in Wilmington. Her tone unusually bright and insistent in a way that suggested she had already planned more than a meal. And because I still wanted to believe these outings were about connection rather than control, I agreed without questioning her motives. We ate at a small cafe near the riverfront, a place Ray and I used to visit on early anniversaries. And as I sat across from my daughter, watching her skim the menu, I felt a faint tug of sadness, the familiar kind that comes when you miss someone who would have understood every quiet nuance of the moment, and before I could fully settle into the memory, Lauren set her fork down and said we just need to stop by a lawyer office for some simple estate papers. Nothing big, nothing stressful, just routine things to simplify your responsibilities. Mom, and the way she said it made something inside me stiffen. I assumed we were going to see Briggs, the lawyer who had guided Ray and me for years, but Lauren drove me to a different building on a different street, a polished office with a plaque that held the name of an attorney I had never met, and she explained casually that Derek recommended him because he specializes in modern streamlining, a phrase that made my heart pulse uneasily as we stepped inside. The attorney greeted us with a practiced warmth and began flipping through a stack of documents, already prepared with my name printed neatly along the top. He described them as standard power of attorney forms and simple estate simplification, a collection of pages that supposedly made everything easier for me. Yet, when he placed the stack in front of me and I read the first few lines, slowly my stomach hardened. because I recognized words that Briggs once warned me to be careful, with terms like irrevocable and full authority, and transfer of title phrases that had no place in a casual lunch errand and carried implications that could turn my entire financial life into someone else's playground. I traced my finger down the page, pretending to struggle with a smudge on my glasses so I could buy time, and as I read further, the knot in my throat tightened every instinct inside me, alerting me to danger, since the language seemed less like help and more like a quiet takeover wrapped in legal politeness. And I remembered Briggs telling Ray and me years ago that if anyone ever asked me to sign something I did not understand entirely, I should walk out. Not hesitate, not negotiate, just walk out. I took a slow breath and told the attorney I would need to bring the documents home so I could read them properly. My voice calm, even though my palms felt damp against the folder, and before the man could respond, Lauren snapped her head toward me and said with impatience, edging her words, "Mom, do not start. We cleared our schedule today. Just sign so we do not have to babysit your bills anymore." Her eyes narrowing with a frustration that made my pulse drum faster. Derek, who had joined us halfway through the meeting under the pretense of being nearby, leaned against the wall with practiced confidence and said, "You want this place protected, right? This is how adults handle assets." And although the statement was framed as advice, it felt more like a threat, a subtle reminder that they believed I was no longer capable of managing what I had spent decades building. I held the folder a little tighter and said, "If it is that important, it can wait one night," my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, and the attorney hesitated, but ultimately nodded, though Lauren exhaled sharply, her irritation unmistakable as she stood up too quickly, sending her chair scraping loudly across the polished floor. The car ride back to the cafe was silent except for the clipped sound of her fingernail tapping the steering wheel. She dropped me off with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes, then sped away before I had fully closed the door, and that evening Eli called asking if everything was all right, because Lauren had texted him saying, "You should have stepped up, Eli, because now I have to do everything," a message laced with resentment that did not match reality, but revealed how deeply she believed her own narrative of burden. I reassured him that nothing was wrong, though my voice trembled enough for him to ask twice, and when we hung up I felt both grateful and guilty. Grateful that at least one of my children still saw me without distortion, and guilty that I had not told him the truth of what was unfolding. A few days later, I was in Raleigh helping with the grandchildren when I walked past Lauren's desk on my way to fetch a coloring book for Maddie. The screen of her laptop still illuminated an email open on it that caught my eye before I could politely look away an email from Derek to a colleague or maybe a friend that said once we get power of attorney and retitle the beach place, we can leverage it for the $400,000 line of credit. And my breath stalled in my chest as I stared at the words that confirmed the fear that had been growing like a shadow behind every polite phrase they fed me. I backed away from the desk quietly, the room suddenly too warm and too tight, and as Maddie tugged on my sleeve asking about crayons, I forced a smile that felt brittle, my heart pounding with the realization that they were planning to stake the house Ray built the house. I maintained the house that held every memory of our life as collateral for their own ambitions, treating it not as my home, but as a tool to fuel their financial ladder. That night when I returned to the beach house, the air felt heavy with the weight of everything I had learned, and I walked into the master bedroom where the old safe still sat, tucked into the closet corner, a relic Ray installed decades ago to hold paperwork he believed might one day matter. I knelt in front of it, my hands trembling as I turned the dial and opened the small metal door, then pulled out an envelope sealed so tightly the paper crackled when I touched it. The writing on the front unmistakably his steady and familiar, a simple line that read for Marilyn if Lauren ever turns into your father. I held the envelope in my hands, the weight of his warning pressing into my palms as the room dimmed around me, and in that moment the air seemed to pause, as if the entire house were waiting for me to open the past he had prepared me for. But I did not break the seal yet, letting the scene cut off at the moment just before revelation, the darkness settling like a curtain around the truth I was about to step into. The envelope felt heavier than paper should feel, as if Ray had sealed not only ink and instruction within it, but a part of himself, a last fragment of the steadiness he carried all through our marriage. And when I finally slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the pages inside the room seemed to tighten around me, the faint hum of the refrigerator fading until there was only the sound of my own breath catching in my chest. While the waves outside struck the shore with slow, relentless rhythm, I saw his handwriting first, the familiar loops and careful spacing, and then the business card of Samuel Briggs tucked neatly behind the letter, along with a simplified copy of the trust document he and Ray had reviewed years ago, when we first considered how to preserve the house from the storms of life and inheritance, my eyes lingering on the bold print that spelled Briggs' name, as if it were an anchor dropped into deep water. The letter opened with words so gentle they made my throat ache. "Mayor, if they ever talk to you the way my father talked to my mother, you call Briggs right away. The house is already protected, but you will need the details." And as I read further, the lines unfurled memories I had tried to fold away, memories Ray never liked to revisit, but sometimes whispered in the dark when fear overtook him. He wrote about his father, cruelty, how that man stripped his mother of every asset after convincing a judge she was too fragile to manage their affairs, how she died poor and unseen despite having built the foundation of their family, and how he swore he would never let that pattern repeat in his own home. The words blurred as tears slipped down my cheeks in quiet streaks, falling not only for Ray's absence but for the terrifying realization that he had predicted this, that he saw shadows of his father in the entitlement. Lauren was now showing that he understood how easily love could turn into leverage when money entered the picture, and my chest tightened with sorrow for the young man he once was, watching his mother fade into poverty while her own children stood by under the illusion that it was for her own good. I sat on the floor with my back against the closet wall, reading the letter again and again, each sentence pulling me deeper into a truth I had not wanted to name. And by the time dawn crept through the blinds, my eyes were swollen from crying, my heart raw in a way I could barely describe. And yet beneath all of that grief was the faintest thread of clarity, thin but unbreakable, the sense that Ray had left me a compass for a reason. Morning arrived with a bang against the quiet when my phone lit up with Lauren, name her voice brisk and impatient as she announced that they were headed down in an hour to go over retreat details, her tone carrying the entitlement of someone who had already decided the house belonged to her. And I forced myself to stand to move toward the kitchen where I tried to make coffee. Even though my hands trembled so much, I spilled grounds across the counter, the brewing scent mingling with fear and a hollow kind of sorrow that made it hard to inhale. By the time their SUV rolled into the driveway, the house no longer felt like mine. Their footsteps entered before their voices did. Lauren, striding in with a printed folder, thick enough to feel like a verdict, while Derek walked behind her, snapping photos of the walls, the floors, the porch railings, sending them to some design team waiting for his updates, and I stood beside the dining table gripping the back of Ray's old chair to steady myself, while Lauren spread her documents across the wood as though staging a business presentation rather than speaking to her mother. She handed me a retreat schedule printed with color-coded blocks and bold deadlines, then slid another sheet forward titled Mom Move Out Checklist, which listed what to take, what to donate, and what to discard, her pen tapping each category, as if she were briefing an employee about an upcoming relocation. And as she spoke, Derek paced around with the casual intrusion of someone already claiming ownership, gesturing at corners and making notes under his breath about how to use the space more efficiently, his excitement chilling in contrast to the panic rising in my ribs. Then came the sentence that finally snapped the last cord of my restraint. Lauren looked at me with rehearsed concern and said, "You either move to Raleigh or we will have to talk to a judge about your competency." her voice soft on the surface but carrying a sharp undertone that echoed her grandfather's words decades ago, and in that instant the room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward, the air thick and unbreathable, as though I had stepped into a long tunnel without light or exits, a place where every doubt Lauren planted began to echo relentlessly against the sides of my skull. I felt my pulse thudding in my throat as if my body were trying to warn me that I was seconds from breaking, that I could either collapse under their pressure or reach for the part of myself that still remembered who I was before grief softened my boundaries. And though part of me wanted to scream or beg or argue, I forced my mouth into a small, steady line and simply said, "All right, if that is how you see me." The words quiet yet sharp enough to slice through the performance they were staging. Lauren seemed satisfied with my silence, mistaking it for surrender, and Derek continued discussing furniture placement while I walked to my bedroom with slow, deliberate steps, feeling the weight of decades clinging to me like damp cloth. I gathered only what mattered most. Ray photographed from our 20th anniversary, the small jewelry box that held my mother, Ring the leather notebook where I wrote private thoughts I never shared with anyone, placing them into a canvas bag, with movements that felt both detached and decisive, as though another version of me were guiding my hands. When I stepped outside, the salt air hit my face with a sting that cleared my head just enough for me to see the path ahead, and though Lauren believed I was heading toward Raleigh, I turned the car in the opposite direction as soon as I reached the end of the drive, the engine humming beneath me like a heartbeat as I crossed the long bridge leaving Ocean Isle behind the marshes, sliding by in blurred streaks of green and brown, while the voice in my mind whispered that Ray had prepared me for this moment long before it arrived. As Wilmington highway signs came into view, I tightened my hands around the steering wheel and let the truth form fully. For the first time, I had one person left to call Ray, old lawyer, the man he trusted with the things he feared most, and as the city skyline rose ahead of me, I prayed silently that it was not too late to pull myself out of the darkness they had pushed me into. The drive into Wilmington steadied my breathing just enough for me to walk into Samuel Briggs' office without collapsing under the weight of everything that had been building his firm was on one of the upper floors, overlooking the slow, wide stretch of the Cape Fear River, the windows catching the morning light in a way that made the whole place feel anchored and immovable. The walls lined with dark wood shelves and heavy frame documents that carried an air of quiet authority. And when Briggs stepped out from behind his desk and said "Mayor" in that familiar tone Ray used to mimic with affection, it felt like someone had finally placed a hand on my shoulder and kept me from falling. He looked older than when I last saw him, lines deeper around his eyes, hair fully silver now, but his presence had the same steady weight, the same calm patience that had made Ray trust him with every major decision we ever faced. And when he gestured for me to sit, I realized how tightly I had been gripping my bag, my fingers stiff from holding all the fear inside. I told him everything, letting the months spill out in a long, trembling confession. The quiet manipulations, the banking access, the missing college funds, the Airbnb strangers wandering through, Ray memories, the staged estate meeting, the power of attorney attempt, the retreat plan, the ultimatum that stripped the floor from under me, and with each detail he listened without interrupting his brow, tightening only slightly when something particularly cruel emerged in the telling. Yet his voice remained steady as he said, "I need you to breathe, Mayor. We prepared for this years ago." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder marked Tate Coastal Trust, sliding it across the table with deliberate calm. And when he began outlining the structure he had built for us in 2021, I felt my pulse slow in disbelief and something close to relief. He reminded me that Ray had insisted on placing the beach house into a trust structure designed to withstand financial pressure or family conflict, that the trust was owned fully by Tate Coastal Holdings, LLC, and that I, not Lauren, was the sole trustee and manager of that entity, meaning no one, not even a child with misplaced entitlement, could transfer, pledge, or control the property without my explicit written consent. My breath stuttered as I repeated the words, sole trustee, quietly under my breath, feeling them land like a warm stone in my chest. Then Briggs added that Lauren had never been a co-owner in any sense, never held equity, never had legal standing beyond being a potential beneficiary who could be removed at any time, a fact Ray had insisted on after confessing his lifelong fear that children could turn on a parent the way his father once had. And I felt my eyes sting, because the man I loved had built a shield around me long before the danger ever announced itself. The shock washed through me first, leaving me momentarily speechless. Then relief rose behind it in a slow, shaking wave, as if someone were cutting open a cocoon I had been trapped inside, and I whispered, "I have been terrified for nothing," and Briggs shook his head gently and said, "No, Mare, you have been terrified because they made you feel small, and that is different from being powerless." A quiet steadiness filled my chest, then a heat that grew into something resolute, and the decision formed itself without hesitation. I looked at him and said, "Then we sell the house before they can touch it." The words coming out soft but sharp like a blade wrapped in velvet, and Briggs nodded once with the seriousness of a surgeon preparing instruments. He outlined the plan with crisp efficiency, calling it Project Sandcastle, as he clicked through documents on his screen, explaining that the Wilmington Regional Hospital Foundation had expressed interest in expanding their wellness programs last year, and had specifically asked whether the beach house would ever be available for purchase as a retreat center because of its location and structure. And he said he could reach out to them that afternoon with a private offer, contingent on an overnight closing if they provided full cash payment, estimating a price of $4.5 million, reasonable and strong enough to lock the deal before sunrise. We worked through the checklist together, Briggs drafting letters to revoke all informal access Lauren had gradually accumulated, removing her from emergency contacts, pulling back online banking permissions she had used to monitor my activity, contacting the bank to freeze any suspicious login pathways, and preparing an immediate notice for the Homeowners Association and the Sheriff Department, stating that Lauren and Derek had no authorized right to host events, rent the property, or enter after closing a clean legal boundary they would not be able to cross without consequence. As he typed each document, I felt the weight on my chest loosen the suffocation, replaced by a rising strength that came from the realization that I was no longer reacting to their cruelty, but shaping its limits. And when he asked whether I wanted all sale proceeds directed into my primary account, I shook my head and said, "I want a portion placed into a scholarship fund, one for older nurses returning to school, women who rebuilt their lives after toxic family struggles or financial hardship, and I want it named the Ray and Marilyn Tate Resilience Fund, no mention of Lauren anywhere." And Briggs paused only long enough to smile before writing it into the sale instructions. The sun dipped lower through the tall windows as we finished the meeting, and before I left, I recorded a small voice-over note in my mind, one I knew would someday belong to the storytelling of this moment. Have you ever had to call a lawyer on your own child? Would you be able to do it? Because the question itself carried a weight that made my heart ache, even as I knew answering it was the first step toward reclaiming the dignity that had been slowly peeled from me. That night, I checked into a small hotel in downtown Wilmington, a modest place with clean sheets and a view of the quiet street below. And while I sat on the bed, the email from Briggs arrived with the final confirmation. The foundation was ready to wire funds at 7:30 in the morning if I signed documents at 6:45, his message short and steady like the man himself. And as I clicked the electronic signature button, I felt my hand tremble, though my vision held clear and firm as if guided by something beyond grief or anger, as if Ray himself steadied my wrist. I barely slept, but the dawn came anyway, pale and cool across the bridge, and at 7:35 my phone rang with Briggs' voice saying, "It is done, Mare. You are no longer the owner of the beach house, and they never were. And I looked at the clock, realizing that at that exact moment, Lauren likely believed I was still packing my things, quietly and obediently. They had 25 minutes left before their new reality hit them. Morning broke with a brightness that felt almost theatrical, the kind of sharp coastal sunlight that made every shadow crisp and undeniable. And at exactly 8 o'clock, the scene Lauren and Derek had been orchestrating in their minds for weeks began to unfold in reality. Though not in the way they expected, their black SUV rumbled up the sandy drive with the confidence of people who believed the day belonged to them, followed closely by a minivan carrying the cleaning crew they had booked to help them strip the house of what they saw as clutter and remnants of the past. Their voices cutting through the quiet morning air as they stepped out. Lauren announcing that everything goes, and Derek laughing that they were turning this place into a coastal boardroom, his tone indulgent and triumphant, as if he had already claimed ownership. Derek walked straight to the front steps with a ring of keys dangling from his finger keys. He believed still symbolized access, and he shoved the largest one into the lock, only to have it stop halfway metal, grinding uselessly against metal. He tried again, harder, and muttered that the old lock must have jammed, then called out in irritation that they needed a locksmith immediately because they were on a tight schedule. Lauren crossing her arms with growing impatience as she checked her phone for the designer who was supposed to arrive later that morning. Before the locksmith could be called, 2 more vehicles pulled into the driveway, a charcoal SUV with the Hospital Foundation emblem discreetly printed near the door, and a sleek sedan driven by realtor Mark Jenkins, a man known in Wilmington for handling high-profile coastal transactions. He stepped out with calm professionalism, followed by Dr. Patel, the executive director of the Hospital Foundation, and 2 assistants carrying clipboards. The group pausing briefly to take in the house, with a respect that contrasted sharply with Lauren's dismissive attitude. Lauren strode toward them with the certainty of someone defending what she believed was hers, and shouted, "Excuse me, this is private property. You cannot just show up like this." Her voice sharp and commanding, and for a moment the driveway fell silent as the crew, the neighbors walking their morning routes and the foundation team, all turned toward the confrontation, unfolding at the entrance. Mark offered a polite, measured smile and said, "You must be Lauren I am." Mark handling the closing for Tate Coastal Holdings. The words landing with such sudden weight that even the gulls above seemed to still. For a moment, Lauren blinked rapidly as if trying to decode a language she had never learned, and said closing for what, in a tone that blended disbelief and rising panic. Mark maintained his composure as he explained that the property had been sold at 7:30 this morning in an all-cash transaction, and that the new owners, the Hospital Foundation, were here to begin preliminary evaluation for their retreat and wellness program. He spoke with gentle clarity, the way one does when discussing facts with someone who is emotionally unprepared for them, and Lauren sputtered that this was impossible because her mother was supposed to move out today and was not capable of handling a sale of this magnitude. Dr. Patel stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone used to managing crises and said very respectfully that Marilyn seemed extremely capable on the video call she had with her attorney, while signing the closing documents, adding that they appreciated the cleaning crew coordination, but that this was now a staff-only facility, and Lauren and Derek were currently trespassing, her tone formal but firm, leaving no room for argument. Derek's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of what was happening, his mouth opening as if to protest when Mark handed Lauren a written notice, drafted by Briggs, clearly stating that any use of the property by Lauren or Derek was now unauthorized, and that continued attempts to enter or schedule events would be met with legal action. The paper trembled visibly in Lauren's grip as the reality sank in. As if the humiliation needed one more nudge to reach its peak, a luxury car pulled into the street in front of the house. A client of Derek, who had been promised a preview of the venue he claimed to control the client, stepped out with an eager smile that evaporated instantly when he observed the scene, Lauren clutching a legal notice. Derek standing speechless beside a locked door, the foundation and realtor clearly in possession of the property, the client eyes narrowing with dawning comprehension that Derek had made promises using a home he did not legally own trust, dissolving right there on the driveway. The cleaning crew shifted awkwardly, uncertain whether to unload equipment or retreat. Neighbors slowed their morning walks to watch the spectacle, one of them whispering to another that they had never seen Lauren look so unsteady, and the foundation assistants continued taking notes with professional detachment, scanning the exterior, while Derek and Lauren tried to regroup in whispers that carried panic rather than control. Lauren pulled out her phone and began dialing rapidly, her voice rising in frustration as she said, pick up, Mom, answer the phone right now." But the only sound that met her was my voicemail greeting. The simple, calm message I recorded years ago. "This is Marilyn. Leave a message." And I did not hear her calls because I was sitting in the quiet lounge of my Wilmington hotel, sipping a warm cup of coffee while watching the boats drift along the river through tall windows that made the morning light feel forgiving. In that moment, I felt no rush to respond and no obligation to soften what they were experiencing, because the timing they once used to corner me had finally come full circle. And as I set my mug down and reached for a small pastry, I let the truth settle, with the same calm certainty that filled my voice when I whispered internally, "They once told me I had 12 hours to get out." Turns out they were the ones being timed. The calls from Lauren stopped after the disastrous scene at the beach house, but the consequences of that morning did not pause for breath. They spread with the speed of a dropped match catching dry grass, beginning with Derek's career, which unraveled faster than either of them anticipated his largest client, the one he had promised a coastal retreat venue to filed an internal complaint, noting that he had misrepresented access to a multi-million-dollar property. And when his supervisor reviewed the rest of his pipeline, they found more red flags, deals built on assumptions about future events he could never deliver. Projections inflated by imaginary venues and retreats that hinged entirely on access he did not own, and his manager called him in with a tone of controlled disappointment that signaled not anger, but loss of trust, the kind of loss that rarely reverses. Within a week, Derek titles and accounts were restricted pending review, and not long after, he was quietly encouraged to resign to avoid further embarrassment, a suggestion framed as a courtesy, but rooted in the fact that no company wanted a broker who built financial promises on fantasies, and with his income suddenly unstable, he applied for a refinance on their Raleigh home only to be rejected because the bank flagged him as high risk due to recent job instability and questionable spending patterns. Patterns Lauren had contributed to, but now blamed squarely on him. Meanwhile, Briggs carried out every step he promised, sending Lauren a formal demand for repayment of the college funds withdrawn without authorization, clearly stating that she had 12 months to return the full amount with accrued interest, or the matter would be reported to both the bank and IRS as misappropriation. A letter written in sharp legal language that made Lauren's hands shake as she read it, the consequences slicing through her earlier confidence like a cold blade. And when she attempted to apply for a personal loan to cover part of the repayment, she was denied because her credit had taken hits she did not anticipate, including late payments on the remodel bills and overdrawn balances from months earlier. The tension inside their home thickened into something suffocating, arguments echoing through the walls as Lauren accused Marilyn of orchestrating her downfall, while Derek accused Lauren of dragging him into messes he never agreed to. And after several nights on the sofa, he packed a bag, muttering that he needed space and did not sign up for a financial implosion, leaving Lauren with a short, cold message that he would be staying with a friend until things calmed, though nothing in their lives showed signs of calming. While their world fractured, mine began to take a quieter, more peaceful shape. I used a portion of the sale proceeds to purchase a small townhouse in Wilmington, a manageable place with no stairs, a tidy yard, and a view of the marsh where herons gathered at dusk, a home sized for someone who no longer needed to hold an entire family together under one roof and the ease of maintaining it felt like exhaling after years of holding breath too long. I transferred funds into the Ray and Marilyn Tate Resilience Fund, and the announcement ran in the church bulletin the following Sunday, a simple line noting scholarships for older women returning to nursing programs, and people approached me after service with warm congratulations, not knowing the personal battlefield that had produced that quiet generosity, only sensing that something meaningful had taken place. Winter crept across the coast with its familiar gray light when the Audacity return arrived 3 months after the public exposure. I was in my small backyard trimming herbs for supper when I heard footsteps on the gravel and turned to see Lauren standing at the gate with Maddie and Josh beside her. The children bundled in coats too thin for the cold, Lauren face, pale and swollen around the eyes, her shoulders slumped into feet, and the sight of her in that state pulled something deep and complicated inside me. Love and sorrow and caution all tangled. She stepped forward and began speaking quickly, her voice trembling as she explained that Derek had not moved back, that the mortgage was behind, that their credit cards were frozen, due to missed payments, that the school had sent a notice about overdue tuition for Maddie, and she said all of it with a frantic edge, mixing regret with justification, as if confessing yet defending at the same time. Then she finally said through tears, "Mom, we just need you to co-sign a small apartment lease until we get on our feet and maybe restart the monthly transfers like before. Just for a little while, please do not let your grandchildren suffer," pressing every guilt button she had learned across a lifetime. I knelt to greet the children and brought them inside, warming milk for Coco and letting them sit on the sofa with blankets while they told me innocent stories about school and playground friendships, their small laughter echoing through my quiet townhouse like a brief reopening of an old door. Then I asked Lauren to step outside with me, closing the sliding door gently so the children would not hear what needed to be said. I told her calmly that I would not co-sign anything, not now, not later, that I would not give her money, that I would not fund the life she and Derek had built on entitlement and manipulation. But I assured her that I would always provide food, clothing, and necessities for the children, and I would connect her with the church job support group, which had helped many families rebuild from financial hardship, and she stared at me as though trying to process a language she did not recognize. Then the anger hit her sharp and loud. She accused me of choosing money over my daughter, her voice cracking with a mixture of fury and desperation. But I held her gaze with a steadiness I had not possessed months earlier, and said quietly, "No, I am choosing boundaries, something I should have done years ago," the words settling heavily between us, as if sealing a door that had remained open far too long. Lauren stormed off, slamming the gate behind her, but a moment later, Maddie slipped back through the opening with soft steps, wrapped her arms around my waist, and whispered, "We like your house, Grandma," before hurrying after her mother, and I stood there for a long moment, letting the warmth of that brief embrace settle into my ribs like a balm. As I returned inside, I felt a quiet truth forming in me, a realization that justice does not always roar or strike. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a simple, unwavering, "know a boundary" finally spoken without fear, and the voice inside me whispered that sometimes justice does not look like revenge. It looks like finally saying no and meaning it. A full year moved across my life like a steady tide, smoothing the sharp edges that once cut through every breath, and by the time I turned 63, my hair had grown a softer silver, but my eyes were clearer than they had been in decades. The townhouse in Wilmington where I now lived had become a small sanctuary painted in quiet colors. The walls decorated with new photographs, snapshots of Maddie stirring cookie dough beside me, Josh handing out programs at the first scholarship ceremony, images that held warmth without the shadows that used to follow me through the beach house halls. My days shaped themselves into a gentle rhythm. I worked part-time as an administrative assistant for the Resilient Scholarship Program at the hospital, a role that kept me connected to a world I had once given my entire career to, and a role that now allowed me to mentor older nurses, returning to school women who carried stories of broken marriages, toxic family betrayal, financial control, and years of giving until they had little left for themselves. And as I sat across from them in quiet offices or hospital lounges, I felt a strange bond, a recognition that survival and rebirth often trace the same path. I also began attending a support group at my church for women who had lived through financial abuse or long-term manipulation, the kind of subtle suffering people rarely recognized from the outside. And each week as we sat in a circle sharing stories of lost accounts, exploited goodwill, and grown children who treated their mothers like safety nets instead of human beings, I felt layers of old loneliness lift from my chest, replaced by something steadier, a sense of belonging built not on duty, but on mutual understanding. Life for Lauren and Derek had shifted into a different landscape entirely. Derek's internal investigation dragged on longer than he expected, and when he finally landed a new job, it came with a lower title and watchful supervision. The stain of the retreat incident clinging to his reputation in quiet whispers that followed him through the industry, and he carried that bitterness into every corner of his life until even his friends grew tired of hearing how unfair the world had been to him. Lauren, on the other hand, rented a modest apartment on the outskirts of Raleigh, a far cry from the glossy lifestyle she once curated on social media. She pieced together freelance marketing work, rebuilding her schedule. One small project at a time, her credit too, damaged for big moves. Her sense of comfort replaced by a consciousness of every dollar spent. Yet somehow she kept going, proving she could survive without leaning on me, even if she had not chosen that lesson willingly. My contact with her settled into something careful, distant, but civil, an exchange of short emails about the children's school events, dentist appointments, and occasional weekends when I picked them up to stay with me. And in those visits, I saw glimmers of the best parts of Lauren reflected in her children, small acts of kindness or quick sparks of humor, reminders that no person is entirely shaped by their worst choices. One afternoon in early autumn, the hospital held its annual scholarship ceremony, a gathering meant to honor the women receiving funding for their return to school. And as I stood near the stage, holding a small stack of envelopes, I saw the new banner for the Ray and Marilyn Tate Resilience Fund hanging beside the podium, the letters printed cleanly their meaning, settling quietly into the air like a blessing. And when the Master of Ceremonies took the microphone and spoke about the generosity behind the scholarship, the legacy of a couple who believed in second chances for women who had sacrificed too much for too long, I felt a swell of emotion rise through me. Not pride exactly, but something rooted deeper, a confirmation that even pain could bloom into something healing. After the ceremony, a few people approached me with warm smiles, including two women I vaguely recognized from Ocean Isle Beach. One of them taking my hand gently and saying, "We heard what your daughter did, and I just want you to know you did the right thing," her voice soft but filled with conviction. And though the comment caught me off guard, I nodded with polite gratitude, feeling no desire to defend or justify anything anymore, because the truth had already settled into my life, with the finality of a stone placed in the right spot. Lauren was not there, and I did not expect her to be. The event was not part of her world anymore, and perhaps that was the quietest revelation of all, that I had become something separate from the role of being her mother, that my identity had space to grow in directions untouched by her expectations or her judgment, and the realization brought a sense of peace so steady I could feel it in my bones. Walking home later, I reflected on everything that had led to that moment, on the decades I spent confusing generosity with love, believing that giving endlessly was the same as nurturing, unaware that giving without boundaries teaches children to expect the world without earning it. And I saw clearly now that the 12-hour ultimatum was never the beginning, but the breaking point of years spent shrinking myself to avoid conflict, Years spent believing that if I just held the family together tighter, it would not fracture, only to learn that holding something too tightly can break it faster. I thought about the women my age who had spent their entire adult lives putting everyone else first, the ones who sat across from me in support group meetings with exhaustion etched into their faces. And I wished I could tell each of them the same thing I had finally learned. If you are my age and you have spent your whole life putting everyone else first, it is not selfish to finally put some order back into your own life, because kindness is not the same as weakness, and love should never require erasing yourself. As the sun began to set, I imagined speaking directly to the women who might someday hear my story, asking them what they would have done if their own daughter gave them 12 hours to leave their home, wondering whether they would think I went too far or not far enough, inviting them to tell me in the comments, because these late-night stories we share help us feel less alone. And if my story kept you company tonight, perhaps they might consider subscribing so we could sit together for the next one. That evening, I walked to the riverfront and sat on a bench overlooking the Cape Fear. The sky washed in shades of pink and gold that shimmered across the water, and I took out my phone to look at the newest photograph Maddie had sent me, her smiling in my kitchen holding a wooden spoon almost too big for her hands, and as the breeze carried the smell of salt and marsh grass, I sensed an ending settling into place. My daughter once told me I had 12 hours to get out, and for a long time those words felt like an eviction from my own story. But sitting there watching the last light fold itself into the river, I realized something truer. What I really had was one last chance to finally walk out on the chaos and into my own peace,